Thank you all for joining us. My name is Vincent Young. I am the AVP of Curriculum Initiatives for the SISMA Foundation, and I run the primary program of the Stock Market Game. Joining me today for the Alexander Hamilton webinar, Maura Ferguson and Chris Meyers from the Museum of American Finance. And Maura, I wonder if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm the Director of Exhibits and Educational Programs, and so I work with Chris with our education team. We put on programs, we have students come in, we lead classroom sessions, and I also work on exhibits at the museum.
And I am Chris Meyers. I'm the Director of Education, and I'm chiefly responsible for developing content like we're going to be covering today and teaching that content.
I'm gonna. If you have a question, please use the question box on the right-hand side of the screen in your dashboard to submit your questions, and we'll answer them. We're not going to hold them to the end. What we're going to do, we're going to try something different today. We're going to answer them on the spot. All right. So please feel free to type in the questions in the question box in your dashboard on the right-hand side of the screen. You may also send me your questions via the chat box. So thank you for joining us. I realize it is the day before a holiday weekend. And Chris, why don't we just go ahead and get started?
Sounds good. Thank you, Vincent. I guess I will give Maura an opportunity to start off with the most common question we hear whenever we have these discussions about Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah, well, that's pretty easy. We at the museum we cover Hamilton a lot in our educational programs and in our exhibits and in events, and we know why he's so special. But I think maybe not everyone else understands what we can learn from him, and why we might single him out from other founding fathers. And so something we want to get at today is to help others understand why he's so important to learn and what we can learn about him. So, Chris, what makes Hamilton relevant today?
I think what makes Hamilton relevant is a couple of things. I mean, when you take a look at the beginning of Hamilton's life and where he grew up, his experiences there greatly shape him and play a role in his multifaceted life. What we're going to be looking at is we're looking at Hamilton from three different perspectives. We're going to be looking at Hamilton as a revolutionary, Federalist, and a financial architect. And then what we're going to do is we're going to be relating the beginning of his life and career and to one of the events that happened at the very end of his life.
Chris, you mentioned, that his character was shaped a little bit in his youth, and so I think this is a great place for us to start. So what was it about how he grew up that shaped how he lived his life?
Well, I think the thing that really shapes him is, I guess, from the beginning is where he grows up. I mean, he actually grows up in the Caribbean. He's one of the few characters that's not directly imported here from Europe or grown up on the continent of the United States. He's actually born and raised in the Caribbean, in a small area of the Eastern Caribbean. If we zoom in here, you can see he's actually born on this island here called St. Nevis. And remember, this particular area here is a pivotal to the triangle trade, of the slave trade, at this particular period. And so it's not only where he's born, but how he's born. He's born on this small island, but his parents are not married, which means in terms of his opportunity for education and general improvement in his station in life are limited because he is considered illegitimate. So he's denied a lot of the more common rights that we would sort of take for granted today. Ultimately, his family moves from Nevis to St. Croix, and his father ultimately leaves, abandons him, and he's left to take care of the family on his own. He ends up taking a job at a business that is integral in the slave trade, and he does such a fantastic job that the owner actually leaves him in charge at the ripe old age of 13 years old. He's left in charge of this particular business. And because the business is intimately involved in the slave trade, he's He understands the financial workings of the business, and he also is exposed to having relationships with slaves or oppressed people, and he feels a certain amount of what I believe is a kindred spirit to these oppressed people because of his background. So those are very important.
So that's interesting. Then he had a good deal of struggle, and it seems like he's making opportunities for himself where he can as he goes. So what's his next step? What does he do after that?
Well, ultimately, he ends up leaving the island and traveling all the way up to Boston.
And, sorry, how does he get to Boston?
That's actually an interesting side story. So while he's on this island of St. Croix, there's actually a hurricane that hits, and the hurricane devastates the island. And as I mentioned before, keep in mind he's only 13 years old, 14 years old. He actually writes an account of the events and what happened. And many of the islanders are so moved at his skill in describing what happened, they actually take up a collection. And they say that this particular individual needs to study at a good university in order to gain some opportunities, so they literally pay for this trip. And keep in mind, this is a 1,700-mile journey, and the boat is going to be a little bit more like this little junk here, as opposed to a large cruise ship. So it was certainly no pleasurable journey. And once he gets to Boston, he ultimately moves down and attends grammar school in New Jersey, where he becomes very well versed and influenced by the changes and events that are happening in the colonies. So he ultimately attends King's College, which is now Columbia University. And while he's there, he spends a lot of his free time not just studying, but also practicing military tactics and studying military history on his own. Becomes very, very active in military initiatives.
So actually, I have two questions for you, Chris. One, it's my understanding he's right next to a very premier college, but instead he goes up to New York from New Jersey. Why does he do that?
So, why does he go to New York to study instead of the College of New Jersey, which actually becomes Princeton University? The reason why he attends King's College instead of Princeton is because of the educational standards. So Princeton, or the College of New Jersey at that time, requires all students to follow the strict course load. Hamilton didn't want to be held to that particular rigid standard. He wanted to be able to take as many courses as he could to get through college as quickly as he could. And Columbia afforded him that opportunity, which is why he went to King's College instead of the College of New Jersey. And again, as I said, so keep in mind, he's taking regular classes, but also studying military history and tactics while he's there.
Why was he so focused on military?
The thing about military is you need to sort of place yourself in the period. What opportunities are there for a person who is orphaned and abandoned and basically an outcast in society? And one of the few opportunities that's available is through military service. This is one of the few occupations where you as an individual can literally move up in rank as time goes on. So he's very interested in pursuing the military not only as a career, but he's also interested in pursuing this military career because of what is happening socially in America at that particular time. So one of the things he does is he joins a voluntary militia, and he actually gathers a group, is able to encourage a couple of his other students to join this particular voluntary militia. And they spend their free time actually practicing in the graveyard of St. Paul's Church, which is just a few blocks up from where King's College was. And they give themselves the name the Hearts of Oak, where he's ultimately adopted a lieutenant rank.
So, so what you're saying is, the military for him is not as much about power as it is about opportunity.
Yeah, I think, he's not necessarily joining the military because, he wants to be a general. He wants to join the military because he wants to get out of poverty. He's looking for an opportunity to prove himself as an honorable, trustworthy person, and he's willing to put in the amount of time in terms of developing his education so that he's well prepared if the opportunity ever presents itself. I think an interesting story relating to his what makes him more interested in proving himself as opposed to advancing a military career is an episode that takes place while he's in college. The president of the college, Miles Cooper, is actually loyal to the Crown of England, and a mob actually shows up in front of his door. Right, the common events of that particular period, people that were loyal to the Crown would often be tarred and feathered, and so Hamilton believes that this type of behavior is dishonorable, that everybody deserves the right to be treated fairly. And he literally jumps in front of the crowd and basically gives them an oratory. And while he's distracting them with this lecture, the president of the university is able to escape out the back. Ultimately, this sort of establishes him as a recognized leader early on in his career, and when the opportunity does present himself, he's ultimately promoted as captain in the provincial army. And part of the reason why he's promoted to captain is because not only that he's proven himself a leader, but he actually comes with a group of individuals that had practiced with him in the graveyards of St. Paul's Church. It's interesting because this particular group, they called themselves the Hearts of Oak, is actually this particular regiment in the New York Provincial Army is still in existence today. I mean, we're talking about nearly 250 years today. 250 years later, the regiment is still referred to as the 1st Battalion, 5th Artillery. And as you can see by their particular logo, they actually have this tree here, right? That's the oak tree, which references the Hearts of Oak that formed its core some, more than 200 years ago. It's still in existence today.
So he's making, again, these opportunities for himself in all these different arenas. So how does he take advantage of it? Is he able to make a name for himself in doing all of this?
Yeah, I mean, he clearly, so he establishes himself in terms of his free time while he's in school. He ultimately becomes, captain of this New York Provincial Army, and ultimately when the Patriots become revolutionary, he is given a commission in the Continental Army. I think one thing that's interesting to point out is just how young he is. At this particular time, 1776, he's only, 19 years old. I don't know how many 19-year-olds that I would trust to be a commander, commanding an army, but so it is. And because he has distinguished himself early and often, he is actually invited to become an aide for some of the more prominent generals during the Revolutionary period, among them being Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox. But he declines these invitations because he wants to be on the front lines. He wants to be able to prove himself in battle, not necessarily as an administrator. So one of the sort of interesting events that happened is that he's involved in the Battle of Princeton, and as he's leading his troops to charge in this particular battle, his horse is shot out from underneath him, and he continues to lead the battle. The general overseeing this particular battle is none other than George Washington, and Washington actually invites him to become his chief of staff, or as it's more commonly referred to, his aide-de-camp. And because it's Washington, and Hamilton is so concerned with being honorable and doing the right thing, he kind of feels as though he can't turn Washington down. So he accepts the appointment and makes his transition from being, on the front lines of the battle or engagement to literally being on the front lines in terms of the operation of the Army.
And it might have been, wasn't what he wanted, was to be on the back end, but did he learn from that? Was he able to use that?
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. He wasn't too enthralled with being an administrator, but if you have to be the administrator, why not make sure it's for the commander of the entire Army? That puts him in kind of a unique position, not only to engage with the commander of the entire Army, but also to engage with the other generals that are involved in carrying out this military activity. And as we move forward in looking at Hamilton as a Federalist, you can see that it's his experience in working with Washington as his chief of staff that shaped some of his opinions about how the government should be formed and the role that the government should play. Keep in mind at this particular time that the document that's governing the law of the land is actually the Articles of Confederation and not the Constitution. And during this whole time that Hamilton is operating with Hamilton is operating with Washington, he's constantly having to marshal limited resources and ask for funding in order to pay for troops and military supplies. But this is very, very difficult to do under the Articles of Confederation, because it's really up to the states. They can choose to participate, choose not to participate. There's little recourse in terms of obliging or obligating the states to contribute resources to the cause. And I think that adds to Hamilton's frustration, in particularly under the Articles of Confederation, and ultimately shape his later initiatives when it comes to establishing an alternative to the Articles of Confederation. So he is elected to represent the state of New York at the Continental Congress, and ultimately off he goes at the ripe old age of 25.
Was there anything significant he did as a representative of the state?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is one of the things that he was passionate about was freeing the slaves, or giving rights to these people that he considered to be pretty oppressed. And as a legislator in the state of New York, he's now in a position where he could actually craft and promote legislation to not only manumit these individuals, but to abolish the institution of slavery altogether. So he does so as a representative. He introduces legislation that makes it easier for slaves to become free when when their owner either dies or passes away through some sort of certification or through their will. One of the other things he does is he establishes a school in Lower Manhattan that's specifically for children of orphan slaves or free people of color, so that they can come and become educated. And I think it's pretty easy to see why Hamilton believes that education is so crucial to success in creating opportunities for somebody. So that's really one of the big things that he does as a representative of New York.
And what about kind of the early formation of the country? What was he doing at the Continental Congress?
It's interesting because there's really kind of two camps that are operating at the Constitutional Convention, and you have sort of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and he is on the Federalist side, And what he's trying to do is he's trying to argue for why it is necessary to have a not just a new government, but a stronger centralized government that has the authority to tax and collect revenue and implement rules for taxation and commerce, and how this would be a benefit to the country. He's not 100% happy with the Constitution as it stands, but he still considers it a vast improvement over the Articles of Confederation. And so this is pretty much the role that he plays throughout the convention in terms of supporting, ultimately becoming a proponent or supporter of the Constitution.
What are some of the things he does to ensure that the Constitution is adopted?
So, as I said, he is, a part of this group referred to as the Federalist. There is another group referred to as the Anti-Federalist, and kind of these two groups are going back and forth in terms of promoting their various plans for the country. Ultimately, the Constitutional Convention passes the Constitution, but now it's up to the individual states to either accept or reject the Constitution. And so Hamilton now sees the anti-federalists out there trying to dissuade the states from adopting this. So what he does is he enlists the help of James Madison and John Jay in order to create some, I guess you would say, early political propaganda, or political advertising. That's probably a little bit more appropriate terminology. Political advertising to support the Constitution, and to make sure that it's known and stressed that the benefits of this particular document far outweigh the cost to the states in terms of individual liberties. And among these Federalist Papers that were created over a period of, I believe it's about 2 years, there were, I think there were, 81 in total? I'm not 100% sure. I think there was 81, but anyway, the vast majority of them were authored by, Hamilton. And the real key point for these particular papers is each one of them is either supporting the idea in the state which is currently voting either to adopt or reject the Constitution, or is refuting an anti-federalist paper that is already being published in that same state as well. But the key here is that he's trying to promote these sort of three key components, which is, a stronger union between the states, a stronger national taxing authority, and a federal government that has more authority to receive revenue from the states. Not to mention there's the other, right, the tripartite system with the executive and judicial balancing out the power of the legislative branch as well. So, sorry, yes, there were 85 essays and in total with Hamilton writing the vast majority of these particular essays. I think here's an interesting quote from one on the right: "The establishment of a constitution in a time of profound peace by the voluntary consent of the whole people is a prodigy, right, to the completion of which he's looking forward to." He's only 30 years old. I think that's what gets me the most, is just how young he is when he's taking on all this responsibility. So ultimately, you can see here this chart is breaking up the various camps between Federalists and Anti-Federalists within the individual states. Ultimately, all the individual states end up passing the legislation, basically prompted by New Hampshire. Once New Hampshire passes, that represents the two-thirds majority, two-thirds simple majority vote, and the Constitution then becomes the law of the land, thereby disbanding the Continental Congress and establishing the first U.S. Congress. So after that, right, Washington is inaugurated here in New York at Federal Hall, just steps from Broadway, and one of the people that he assigns to help him in this new government is none other than Alexander Hamilton.
Chris, we've seen Hamilton distinguish himself in a few different arenas by this point. He's always taking as many advantages as he can. Why does Washington support him as Treasury Secretary?
That's an interesting question. It's not to say that Hamilton is not competent in other areas. He's clearly proven himself on the battlefield. But I think when you take a look at a couple of events, he's working in the clerk's office, managing a business when he's 13 years old. And there's another particular episode which, keep in mind, the capital of the United States at this time is actually in New York City. And there's another episode which sort of distinguishes him for his financial mind and gives him a certain amount of credibility for this particular role at an early or young age. And that's actually when the British leave New York. Keep in mind, when the British leave New York, they take with them huge, basically all their hard currency, their specie, their gold and their silver. And when they do, there's really limited amount of funds left over for reconstruction or merchants to fund their day-to-day activities in their business. So what's needed is an institution or a bank that will be able to collect deposits and make funds available for reconstruction and day-to-day business activities. So there are various plans that have kind of floated around, and ultimately people turn to Hamilton and ask him what does he think, and he comes up with a plan to establish a bank in Lower Manhattan. That particular bank is referred to as the Bank of New York. It's the second oldest bank in the United States and still exists to this day. It's operating in its third century here in the United States. It's the first stock listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And in more recent history, it was ultimately merged with Mellon Bank out of Pittsburgh in 2007. Today, that bank is referred to as BNY Mellon, and they custody approximately $28 trillion in assets. So it's this particular series of events that leads Jefferson to choose Hamilton as the first Treasury Secretary. That's one of the things I'd like to point out, maybe just a personal plug. If you can see the two buildings at the bottom, the building on the left-hand side represents the first Bank of New York, and the building on the right is actually the third Bank of New York, which is the current home of the Museum of American Finance. So when establishing this bank, right, he's 27 years old.
Okay, so I think you've outlined why he was an excellent candidate for the position. What does he do once he's there?
So what does he do? Well, he does a lot of things. And I'm going to see if I can try to, this is an hour-long presentation after all, I'm going to see if I can try to keep this short and sweet. And basically what he does is he engineers a modern financial system here in the United States in a very, very short amount of time. Well, what is a modern financial system? A modern financial system has several core things, and among them there are three that are most important, and that is a stable currency, a central bank, and securities markets. And when you have those three things, you encourage not only a broad banking system, but you encourage the development of a broad set of businesses to be established in wherever that particular financial system takes place. And to give you an idea of what the state of the financial system was in the United States at the particular time. The government is bankrupt. There are limited securities markets. There is no centralized bank. The currency being used, right, the majority of all currency being used is literally from another country, or is a promise to pay, is not really backed by anything. There are a few businesses and few banks as well. After Hamilton comes along, as I said, in a very short period of time, he establishes a central bank with several branches, establishes currency that encourages the growth in businesses, and additional banking system. Additional banks end up arising, and you can see here as the number of banks increase, what they do is they attract depositor funds. And as the number of banks increase, the amount of funds available to be lent out for businesses and new ideas and entrepreneurs as they come to this country, there's more opportunity. And as you can see, when there's more opportunity, you see growth of the number of businesses that operate here in the United States.
That's a great snapshot of what changes he makes. Let's just look quickly about into how he makes some of those changes. So if we can start with public finances.
Sure. The issue with public finances is that after the Revolutionary War, we have a new nation. However, this new nation was forged out of a lot of obligations. Right? So now the new nation has been created, but how do you pay for all these debts that have been incurred in paying for the war? Keep in mind, what has been paid for is not just the food and ammunition, but the soldiers themselves had to be paid for. And why was this such a critical part in our nation's history? Well, the first reason is because the number was so large. The nation, as a nation, we owed about $75 million, which is equivalent to about $900 billion today. And we owed that to people who had provided, right, the military might in order to help us become an independent nation. So people were concerned that if these people became upset, they might turn their guns back around on us again. So paying off these debts was very critical to stabilizing the nation and making sure that the nation prospered. So one of the things that he does in terms of coming up with a solution is he says the first thing we need to do is we need to redeem all these debts at full value, and we need to assume all the individual state debts into one national debt in the name of the new country, the United States. And you can see here we have an early continental note. Here's another example of a continental note. And I have yet another example of continental note. And keep in mind, these pieces of paper, these notes here, were the promissory notes that were given out not only to merchants who had funded munitions and food and whatnot to the Army, but these were also the notes that were given out to soldiers. And the value of these notes, this one here, this particular note here says that it pays approximately $20. Prior to Hamilton's idea of, excuse me, prior to Hamilton's idea of redemption and assumption, this particular note would have been trading at somewhere around 50 cents to $1. So he comes up with this particular plan, and the value of these particular notes becomes very valuable again. And what happens is this actually incurs a little bit of opposition from Madison and Jefferson. And they're sort of concerned that this particular idea of redemption and assumption is an overarching authority on Hamilton's part and will undermine individual states' rights. And so what happens is these men are forced to try to come to a compromise. Hamilton believes that by assuming all these individual state debts and paying these debts on time, that it will create a sense of credibility in the new government. And so ultimately what they do is the men meet just kind of down the road here at Maiden Lane, and they come to a compromise. This compromise is considered to be the first great compromise in the new government. It is also referred to as a dinner table bargain. And what this does is this, Madison and Jefferson agreed to support Hamilton's plan for redemption and assumption, but in return, the capital of the United States now has to be moved from New York City, right, to what is now this District of Columbia, right, somewhere in between kind of north and south. I also might add that it's closer, much closer to Jefferson's home. So one of the other things that he does is, beyond the redemption and assumption, is to figure out what it's going to take to pay off this particular debt. He calculates the government needs about $3 million a year in order to operate, but also in order to pay down this total of $75 million. And what he does is he creates a series, well, he wants to establish a series of tariffs and basically sales taxes on goods that are created and imported here into the United States. Congress ultimately refuses the sales tax, but Madison again helps Hamilton in establishing tariffs. And what Hamilton does is he proposes a series of tariffs specifically in order to promote not only U.S. products but U.S. manufacturing. Keep in mind he's only 33 years old.
And how does he encourage business?
He encourages business. I mean, you know, obviously through, you know, this tariff and taxation methodology, making imported goods more expensive than domestic goods. But one of the other things that he does is he establishes a fleet of ships off the coast of America. Keep in mind, most of the merchant activity that's taking place is naval merchant activity. And even before the days of the Revolution, you know, smuggling of the importation of these particular goods for which the government would tax these goods and generate revenue was a problem. And during the Revolution, it was only, you know, it was made even worse because, right, you don't have the resources in order to stamp this out. So what Hamilton does is he proposes a police force of revenue cutters that will patrol the waters of the coast of the new nation in order to stamp out smuggling. Keep in mind that, you know, Hamilton is acutely aware of the business advantages of smuggling. Remember, this is a child of the Caribbean, and so he is no stranger to piracy and its effects on business. What's interesting about this particular institution is that it ultimately, you know, boosts the economy and promotes merchant activity, but it transforms over its 200-year history into what we now refer to as the U.S. Coast Guard.
You mentioned a central bank. How did he establish that?
Well, he actually drafts a report establishing the central bank, and he basically says that in order for the government to efficiently collect taxes and make payments to creditors, but also to service providers, we should have a centralized bank. Not only should the bank pay for the collect taxes and make payments, but the bank should also act as sort of the lender of last resort, holding deposits for other individual banks in order to protect them. And this particular idea is not new. He actually takes this idea from the Bank of England and believes that it will ultimately stabilize not only the banking system, but also promote a larger availability of funds for businesses. One of the things to keep in mind, though, is that this is not 100% run by the government, right? This is a combination of privately and publicly held funds.
Chris, does the bank still exist today?
Well, this exact central bank that Hamilton established does not exist today. We have the physical location here that's in Philadelphia, but we do have something similar, and that is the Federal Reserve system that we have today. Centralized bank model has proven time and again to be necessary not only in providing the lender of last resort, but in promoting stability throughout the banking system, particularly in times of crisis.
And what's the last thing he does?
The last thing he does is stabilize currency. Right? He creates writes a report and establishes the mint. Keep in mind, the most common form of money at this particular time, right, is gold and silver, and not the individual banknotes. The banknotes are actually a substitute. Each one of those banknotes promises to pay a specific amount of gold or silver. One of the more common methods, one of the more common recognized units of currency was actually the Spanish eighths. And the reason why it's called Spanish eighths is because of how the coin would be broken apart into different pieces. You keep cutting the coin in half instead of, then you ultimately have pieces of eighths, okay, as opposed to a decimal system, which Hamilton actually prefers. He wants a gold standard, but recognizes that, again, gold is in limited supply here in the United States, and issues bimetallism, issues gold and silver because he believes that it will lead to a more stable currency. And he issues these ratios of currency, particularly, right, a dollar, half dollar, a dime, a quarter, a nickel, in units that are more common to European countries, making it easier for convertibility.
So, for all of these things that Hamilton did, was there an immediate or a lasting benefit that resulted from these accomplishments?
Yeah, I think the lasting benefit is several things. I guess a lot of lasting benefits. I think the first way to describe it is because there is an encouragement for banks, there is encouragement for additional capital, and these banks lend this capital. This capital is used literally in the expansion of the nation as a whole, from its early colonial roots, right? Bridges, roads, tunnels. These are all endeavors that require money. Where do these endeavors get money? They get it from the bank. And by having these stable sources of funds, the country is able to grow. I think a perfect sort of summary of how the nation is able to grow because of these things that Hamilton does in establishing a modern financial system is actually the Louisiana Purchase. Keep in mind, right, that the Louisiana Purchase is more commonly given credit to Jefferson. I mean, it does happen during his administration, but keep in mind that the United States is a new nation, a young nation, and like most young people, the nation doesn't have a lot of money. But what it does have is it has credit. It has credit and it has credibility because it's been paying off these war bonds under Hamilton's assumption and redemption policy. And it creates credibility in what I think is one of the more pieces of irony in history. An English bank, Barings Bank, actually raises the funds for America to purchase Louisiana territories from Napoleon, literally doubling the size of a former colony overnight.
So we've covered his main contributions to the country, and I know there's kind of a piece of his story that's still left, and sometimes that's what he's known best for, but what's the last piece of the story?
Well, the last piece of the story is, right, the most famous, I think, piece of the story. I think it is a little bit of a shame that he's known more for how his life ended than for his accomplishments in his life, but hopefully we've had a chance to kind of address that today. And really the final years come down to the relationship between him and one man, and that man being Aaron Burr. These two were not only political rivals, they were sort of rivals throughout the Revolutionary War. They were also rivals within the state of New York. Particularly, they were both attorneys as well. And they, throughout their entire career, they conflicted quite a lot. Actually, I don't know if Vince, you can select the little PBS logo on the bottom there, and that whole particular story. No, okay. So I've left the link down there at the bottom if you want to explore the relationship that these two men have had, sort of the conflict that they've had ongoing off and on throughout their careers. But it basically all comes to a head in the election, the New York election of 1804 for governor. And Burr is trying to run for governor of New York, and Hamilton vehemently opposes having Burr as governor of New York. And there's an episode during a dinner party where he makes some comments about Burr that ultimately come out to public, where Hamilton is referred to as describing Hamilton as despicable, amongst other things. And Aaron Burr sees this as the final straw in a long litany of personal and public slights that Hamilton has engaged in over his career. He finally challenges Hamilton to a duel. They keep in mind that dueling is actually illegal in the state of New York, and these two men are actually forced to get into a boat and travel to the other side of the Hudson River on the shores of Weehawken, New Jersey, in order to engage in this particular activity. And even in this particular episode, there's some controversy between the two men because there really is no official account. People that support Hamilton say that Hamilton wasted his shot, and Aaron Burr, took Hamilton's life. And keep in mind too that Aaron Burr in this particular episode is actually vice president as well. So there's controversy even at the end, as there was in the beginning. I don't think I mentioned, but there's actually some argument in terms of when Hamilton was born, how old he was. There's some people that say he was born in 1755. Some people say he was born in 1757. But so there's a certain amount of symmetry and connectedness in terms of how and when he was born and how his life had ended. But I think the central theme really is I think he remains relatively true to himself. I don't know if there's... So, what do we think?
I mean, some of the things we can learn from him, I think, are creating opportunities for yourself. He was born into nothing but challenging opportunities, and or challenging situation, and he made opportunities, and I could see that being similar to students today, using their abilities, their knowledge to further themselves, writing an essay, getting a scholarship, not so unlike what happened to Hamilton, that enabled him to travel to America to constantly take on new challenges and to push himself. And I think that's a really great message that we can see, and I think that's still relevant today as well.
And that's a good point, Maura. I think Hamilton, especially that one example that was really telling, was Hamilton's defending that loyalist at the college.
Mm-hmm.
Just a question before we move on. You made it to the point to tell us his age.
Mm-hmm.
What was his age comparable relative to Madison and Jefferson? And was it easy? My assumption is that he was younger than them.
Yeah, he was younger. He was younger than them, and keep in mind, most of the power and most of the authority, particularly as it relates to the economic activity in the United States, is all happening in the South. Why is it happening in the South? Well, because the colonies and/or America is an agrarian society, and most of the economic activity that's taking place is in the South. It starts off with tobacco plantations and morphs into cotton plantations plantations, and so in terms of contrast, these early ideologies. Remember, Hamilton is not a landowner, nor is he a slave owner. So there's some certain fundamental differences, and those fundamental differences, both socially and politically, kind of do play themselves out in how these men engage each other. Although maybe not necessarily always the most professionally, but I think you can see where some of these early divisions along these ideological lines end up playing themselves out throughout the rest of American history, particularly as you get towards the Civil War.
Well, on a personal level, being that he was much younger than his peers, and being that, can I assume that his abolitionist nature was contrary to what most of his peers felt, and so was it hard for him how hard did he have to fight to earn the respect? Do we assume that he had immediate acceptance from his peers, or was it a?
I mean, even within, I think, so between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, certainly there's a certain amount of, distinct animosity. People want to label him in supporting a strong federal government, a strong national government. But yes, even within his own party, there's a certain amount of animosity towards some of his ideas. I mean, there is actually an episode in which he writes to John Jay where he suggests that we should use slaves to literally give them weapons to fight for their freedom, that they would be a great asset. And when I was talking a little bit about the manumission initiative that he has within the state of New York, he's relatively selective about who he has these discussions with, because it is such a radical departure from kind of the norm at that particular point. And I think, he does recognize that there are certain limitations in terms of, just assuming that everybody's going to warm to his particular ideas, which is why he, like I said, in his New York representation, he focuses on doing what he can instead of trying to change everybody's mind.
Great, thanks.
So, will we have any other questions, or we wanted to? That's pretty much about it for the presentation. I just kind of wanted to highlight a couple of the resources that we have here at the museum. I know Vincent doesn't have access to actually selecting some of the materials, but I wanted to at least put Maura and my information up here on the screen, so that if you wanted to reach out to us and ask us for some more information, we'll gladly help you as quickly as we can. I also wanted to put on the link on the webpage for the museum. This is moaf.org, and this is our education page. If you look within that education page, you'll see a series of classes, and this particular class is one of the classes that we offer at the museum. There's also a PDF which contains a lesson plan if there are teachers out there that want to try to refer to some of this material within their lesson plan. That information is out there available for you.
Chris Moore, I know you have a special Hamilton room in the museum. What kind of Hamilton resources do you have, and even resources about the central bank and the coin that Hamilton?
Yeah, so we actually we do have a room that's dedicated specifically to Alexander Hamilton, and then in that room we have some artifacts relating specifically to the Federalist Papers. We also have one of his earliest reports on the state of the nation, where he puts together a comprehensive report of all the departments that are operating within the government, or that are necessary in order to fulfill the operations of the government, and each of their department costs and outlines, how much they're spending and what exactly they're spending their money on. We have that in there as well. We also have some early checks that he wrote. And what is there? I think there's a note in there as well. Is there an early note on? I forget exactly what's on the left-hand side of the case. And then the room is kind of decorated in the style of what would have been, a bank manager's office during the, mid to late 18th century. And in addition to the Hamilton Room, we currently have an exhibit promoting the 100-year anniversary of the Federal Reserve. And we have two parts to that particular exhibit. We have the main exhibit, which explains the Federal Reserve System through a series of, I guess you would call it offices?
Yeah. Basically what we've done with that exhibit is we've taken a few positions at the Federal Reserve and shown what a day for them might be like, or things that they might reference, or what they do in their job as pieces of the puzzle of what makes up the full Federal Reserve. So that's a piece of it, as Chris mentioned. Another piece is we have 100 objects relating to the Federal Reserve. That's really interesting, with an audio guide component, so you can hear the stories, hear some oral histories from officers at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And then we have a feature also on the New York Fed in the exhibit as well.
Oh, sorry, yeah. The thing with the New York Fed is kind of interesting because it does play a special role in the financial system, not just the Federal Reserve System, in that all the activities that are conducted by the Federal Reserve are conducted by the New York Fed branch. So.
Great, thank you. And actually, you're a block over from New York Fed.
Yeah, we're so that the slide where we showed Washington being inaugurated as the President of the United States, we're 1 block away from that. So we are, let's see, what is that, west? We're 1 block east from where George Washington was inaugurated, and we're also 1 block south of the New York Federal Reserve. So if you ever choose to come down to the museum, please keep in mind that you can also see the Fed and visit the Federal Hall. That is part of our national park system. I don't know if I know the original Bible that Washington used is sometimes kept there, but I'm not exactly sure quite when and how it's there. But there's actually a museum in there as well. Keep in mind that was operated as a sub-treasury. The bulk of the income that was generated to support the federal government was through the taxation of imported goods. And you have a lot of goods that were being imported here into the ports of New York. And there are actually some safes that you can see within Federal Hall where you would keep the money for the goods that were taxed as they came in.
Okay, great. Any last words before I close up the session here?
No, I just wanted to say thank you to you, Vincent. I really appreciate you taking the time to let us come down here and to talk about Hamilton. And I also wanted to thank the other attendees for taking their time out. I know being sandwiched in between Good Friday and Tax Day is probably not necessarily the greatest time, but we're so glad and happy that you were able to attend, and we hope that you were able to understand Hamilton in a way that was hopefully multidimensional and maybe a little bit more interesting than what you read in your textbooks.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Maura. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Unless there's any more questions, I am going to end the webinar. Know that this webinar has been recorded and will be available sometime next week. If you have any questions, Chris, if you wouldn't mind repeating your email.
Yep, here it is. It's cmyers@moaf.org, and Morris is mferguson@moaf.org.
And you can email me at vyung@sifma.org. That's vyoung@sifma.org. I will send a message around to all the attendees to let them know when this when this recording will be available. And have a good holiday and have a good weekend. Thank you very much for joining us.